Everyone thought she was just the maid, until the twins she cared for whispered, "We wish you were Mommy." And when their billionaire father walked in and heard it, nothing in that house would ever be the same again. The wind rolled in from the Pacific, brushing against the tall palms lining the gates of Sandcastle Estate. Inside, the marble halls gleamed with silence, the kind of silence that came not from peace, but from emptiness. In a room that looked more like a museum than a home, Jake Anderson, tech mogul and billionaire widower, stood in front of a massive window. He stared out at the ocean, holding a whiskey glass he hadn't touched. It was 7 a.m. The day had just begun, and already he dreaded it. Down the corridor, muffled thuds and footsteps echoed from the West Wing. The twins were awake, or at least moving, but Jake didn't go to them. He never did. Not because he didn't care, but because he didn't know how. He hadn't known how since Lauren died. Across the estate, in a much smaller, sunlit room tucked behind the laundry wing, Caroline Ross pulled her long braids into a loose bun, buttoned up her uniform, and checked the time. 7:03 a.m. She had been at the estate for 3 weeks. To the staff she was polite, quiet, efficient. To Jake she was invisible. But to the twins, Aidan and Ethan, Caroline was something else entirely. The first day, they wouldn't look at her, wouldn't speak, just rocked gently side by side in the corner of their playroom, two tiny souls shut off from the world and from their father. But Caroline didn't try to fix them. She just sat, read stories out loud, blew bubbles, let them draw on her hands with markers. She met them where they were, not where the world thought they should be. And now they waited for her at the door every morning. No words, just soft smiles, and eyes that finally saw someone. At exactly 7:15, Caroline pushed open the door to the boys' room. She greeted them softly, placing 2 small juice boxes on the table, and knelt down to their level. "Ready for bubble time?" she whispered with a warm smile. Aidan blinked twice and gave the slightest nod. Ethan grabbed the little bubble wand from her pocket before she could even stand up. And just like that, the silence, the heavy, aching silence of this house, began to lift. Meanwhile, Jake stood at the top of the stairs, hearing faint laughter he hadn't heard in months. He turned toward the sound, but stopped himself. He told himself he didn't have time. A board meeting, a phone call, something, anything. Because deep down he knew what that sound meant. Someone else was reaching his sons, and it wasn't him. The sun poured into the playroom like honey, soft, golden, gentle. Caroline sat cross-legged on the carpet, her shoes off, her sleeves rolled up. Ethan sat on one side of her, clinging tightly to a small plush elephant. Aidan sat on the other, his tiny hands resting on her knee, eyes locked on the shimmering soap bubble she had just released. It floated, swirled in the light, and for a moment, time didn't just slow, it paused. Then came the sound. Laughter. It started small, a single giggle from Ethan, then a full, sudden burst from Aidan. It wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, but to Caroline it was everything. She gasped, smiling so wide her cheeks ached. "You like that one, huh?" she whispered. Another bubble, then another. The boys leaned in, eyes tracking each glimmering orb. Ethan reached out, his hand brushing hers. "Pop," he said. Just one word. And it was enough to make Caroline's throat tighten. "You said pop," she whispered, stunned. "You said a word, sweetie." He looked at her, smiled. Aidan leaned in closer now, whispering something only Ethan could hear. They giggled again, secret jokes shared space. Then in unison both boys looked up at her, eyes wide, hearts open. And they said it. "We wish you were Mommy." Silence. Caroline froze, her heart stopped. Not because she didn't feel the weight of it, but because she did. She didn't respond at first. What could she say? She looked at them, those two beautiful, brilliant, misunderstood boys, and then gently reached out, pulling them close. One in each arm. She whispered, "That means more than anything in the world." Behind her, a shadow moved. Jake had walked into the room 5 seconds ago. He'd meant to check in quickly, maybe ask a question about the cleaner in the garage. But what he saw froze him in place, his sons, in someone's arms, laughing, smiling, speaking, saying words they never said, not to him, not to anyone, and worse, saying them to her. "We wish you were, Mommy." He didn't mean to say anything, but his voice betrayed him before his mind caught up. "What is this?" Caroline jerked her head around. The boys didn't flinch, they just stared at their father. Jake stepped forward slowly, his face unreadable. I'm sorry," Caroline stammered, letting go of the boys. "They were just playing. I didn't mean to." Jake raised a hand, not to scold, just to stop the rush of words. He looked at her, then at his sons, and for the first time in weeks, maybe months, he didn't feel in control. He felt replaced, and he had no idea what to do with that. If you were him, standing in that doorway, hearing your kids say that to someone else, what would you do? Be honest. Drop your answer in the comments, and if you're feeling this story already, take a second, subscribe. Stories like this take hours to write. That one click helps us keep telling them for you. Jake didn't say another word. He just turned and walked out. The door didn't slam. The boys didn't cry. But Caroline sat there, hands still trembling slightly, her heart pounding in her chest. Something had shifted, not just for the boys, but for all of them, and nothing in that house would ever be the same again. Jake didn't sleep that night. The house was dark, silent again. The twins had gone to bed without a word. No requests for bedtime stories, no bubbles, just silence. And Caroline, she hadn't said goodnight either. Jake sat in his office, staring at the security footage from earlier that day, something he never did. But tonight, he needed to see it again. Not to analyze, to confirm. There they were, his sons, laughing, reaching, talking. With her, a stranger really, a maid. A woman he'd barely acknowledged since she started, and yet she had given them something he couldn't, something their own mother, God rest her soul, hadn't lived long enough to give. Connection. But instead of feeling grateful, Jake felt something ugly rise in his chest. Shame. And behind it, something worse. Jealousy. Down the hall, Caroline lay awake in the small staff bedroom. She stared at the ceiling fan spinning above her like time she couldn't catch. She kept replaying the moment in her head, their words, his reaction. "We wish you were Mommy." She hadn't asked for that. She hadn't even wanted it. Had she? A small part of her whispered, "Yes, you did. Not for the title, not to replace anyone, but because, for the first time in years, she felt needed, not for cleaning, not for folding sheets, but for who she was. But now she felt like she'd crossed a line she didn't even know existed. She pulled the blanket over her chest, turned to the side and whispered, "I'm not their mother. I know that." But her heart didn't agree. The next morning came heavy. Caroline walked into the playroom with soft steps, her smile shaky but present. But the twins didn't run to her like before. They sat apart, quiet, not angry, just unsure. Ethan looked at her, then looked away. Aiden picked at the corner of a book, not opening it. Caroline knelt beside them, unsure whether to speak or wait, so she chose silence. Sometimes silence said more. After a minute, Ethan scooted closer. His head touched her arm, but only for a moment. Then he was gone again. Like the laughter from yesterday had been a dream. Jake, from the hallway, watched. He didn't step in, didn't interrupt, but he didn't go back to his office either. He just stood there, like a man looking through glass, watching a world he wasn't part of, and didn't know how to enter. Later that day, Jake passed Caroline in the hallway. Their eyes met. He gave her a slight nod. She returned it. Neither said a word. But in that look was an entire conversation. "I saw. I didn't mean to overstep. I don't know how to be their father. I wasn't trying to take your place." But none of it left their lips. Just silence, louder than ever. It was supposed to be a normal Friday. Caroline had just finished organizing the boys' art supplies when Maria, the estate's house manager, rushed into the room, frazzled. "There's a gas line issue in the back kitchen," she said breathlessly. "The crew needs the lower wing evacuated. No one can be down there for at least 24 hours. Caroline blinked. "That includes staff quarters?" Maria nodded. "You'll need to sleep upstairs tonight. East wing." Caroline froze. The east wing, where Jake's private suite and guest rooms were. She swallowed the tightness in her throat and simply said, "Understood." That night, Caroline walked slowly down the pristine east corridor, her overnight bag slung over her shoulder. The walls here felt colder, quieter. The carpet muted every footstep like it had something to hide. Jake was already in the guest lounge, poring over spreadsheets on his laptop when she entered. The room was dim, save for the flickering fireplace and the soft rustle of pages from the boys' coloring books left behind. He looked up. Their eyes met. Again, no words. Just a nod. "Maria told you?" he asked finally. "Yes. I'll stay out of the way." "You're not in the way," he said, almost too quickly. Then silence again. Jake closed the laptop. "Do you want a drink?" he asked awkwardly. "There's ginger ale, or wine." Caroline hesitated. "Ginger ale's fine." He poured her a glass. She took it, their fingers briefly touching. The fire crackled. Neither sat, just stood in silence, sipping, the space between them thick with unspoken questions. Jake broke it first. "You've been good with them?" Caroline looked up. "They're good kids." "They weren't before." "They were. They were just hurt." Jake looked at her, really looked at her, for maybe the first time. "You get them," he said quietly. Caroline placed her glass down. "I try." "You do more than try." The silence returned, heavier now. Then Jake said it. "When they called you Mommy, it hurt. Not because of you, because I wasn't enough for them." Caroline's voice softened. "It wasn't about being enough, Mr. Anderson. It was about being present. And sometimes presence doesn't come from blood. It comes from effort." Jake sat down. Caroline, after a moment, joined him. The fire warmed the room, but it was something else that softened the air between them now, a shared ache. "At this point, what do you think he should do? Should Jake lean into this growing bond, or keep his pride and distance?" Drop your answer in the comments. They didn't speak much after that. But when Jake stood and softly said, "Good night, Caroline," she replied, "Good night, Jake." And that was the first time he had let her call him by name. The next morning, fog hugged the windows of Sandcastle Estate, casting a pale silver light across the house. Jake sat at the kitchen island, a half-empty mug of black coffee beside him, untouched. He hadn't left for the office. He hadn't picked up his phone. He just sat, lost in thought. Caroline stepped in quietly, holding Ethan's favorite plush toy, which she'd found under the couch. Jake looked up. She hesitated, then approached. "I think someone dropped this last night," she said softly. Jake took it from her, his fingers brushing the soft, worn fabric. "He sleeps with it every night." Caroline nodded. She turned to leave, but something in Jake stopped her. "Wait," she turned back. Jake cleared his throat. "Do you have a minute?" She blinked. "Sure." He motioned to the stool beside him. She sat, and after a pause so long it nearly became a silence too big to fill, Jake finally spoke. "I wasn't always this closed off," he began, voice low. "When Lauren, my wife, was alive, I was different. We were different. I worked too much, but she balanced it out. She was sunlight, pure sunlight." He laughed softly, bitterly. "We didn't know we were having twins. The doctors only caught it at month 6. She laughed. I panicked." Caroline listened, still, present. "She died giving birth to them. A complication. One moment I was pacing the hospital hallway, the next—" His voice caught. Caroline's eyes glistened, but she didn't speak. Jake pressed on. "I held 2 screaming babies in my arms, and I felt nothing, just numb, then guilt, then anger, at her, at myself, at them. He looked up at Caroline, eyes red. I know it's wrong, but for the first few months, I couldn't even look at them without thinking she died for them. How messed up is that? Caroline spoke softly. It's not messed up, it's human. Jake blinked. He hadn't expected that. She continued, grief does strange things. It distorts love, warps the memory. But love doesn't vanish. It just gets buried. Jake stared at her for a long moment. And in that silence something shifted, a crack in his armor, a space just wide enough to let someone in. Caroline stood. I should check on the boys. But just as she turned, Jake asked, What about you? What brought you here? Caroline paused, then sat back down. My mum was a maid. Chevy Chase, Maryland. She raised 3 of us, cleaning homes she'd never afford. I said I'd never follow in her footsteps. But after I lost my teaching job during COVID, this was the only work I could find. She smiled faintly. Funny how life brings you full circle. Jake whispered, You were a teacher. Special needs, she said. Aiden and Ethan, they remind me of some of my brightest students. Jake didn't respond, but his jaw tightened, his eyes softened, and in that moment respect bloomed. They didn't say goodbye when she left the room, but they didn't have to, because something had changed, and neither of them could pretend otherwise. Sunday morning came with the smell of sea air drifting through the open kitchen window. Caroline stood at the island in an oversized apron, flipping small blueberry pancakes while humming an old Motown tune under her breath. From the hallway, Aiden peeked in first, then Ethan. They paused in the doorway, watching, waiting. Caroline noticed them, but said nothing. She simply flipped another pancake and slid it onto the growing stack. Aiden took one cautious step in. Ethan followed. Then, without a word, they both climbed up onto the stools at the island. Caroline smiled, but didn't speak. She slid 2 pancakes onto their plates. Blueberries today, she said, setting down a small pitcher of syrup. Thought we'd try something special. Aiden reached out and dipped a fingertip in the syrup. Ethan giggled. Caroline chuckled softly. Don't tell me you two are finally turning into pancake people. Jake entered, just as the boys began eating. He paused. There they were, his sons, sitting calmly. No devices, no therapists, just being kids, laughing, eating, and at the center of it all, her. Caroline glanced at him, unsure, but Jake just smiled faintly and stepped forward. Got any more of those? A little while later they all sat at the table, Jake included. It was quiet, but not the tense kind. It was comfortable. Aiden tapped Jake's arm and pointed at his pancake. Jake leaned down. Want me to cut it for you? Aiden nodded. Jake did. Caroline watched, softly. Later that afternoon, Caroline took the boys out to the garden with bubble wands and chalk. The driveway quickly filled with crooked hearts and shaky stick figures. Jake watched from the balcony above, and for the first time, he didn't feel like an outsider looking in. He just watched, smiling. That evening, Jake approached Caroline in the garden while the boys napped on a blanket. He handed her a mug of tea. I figured you might like chamomile. She accepted it, surprised. Thank you. They sat in silence, watching the sun drop over the horizon. Jake broke it softly. They don't laugh like that with anyone else. Caroline looked down at her tea. They don't have anyone else. You've given them something I couldn't, Jake said, voice low. Caroline turned to him. That's not true. It is. There was a long pause, then, You're good with them, Jake said. And you're learning, Caroline replied. He looked at her. She looked right back. This time, neither looked away. If this moment made you smile even a little, hit that subscribe button. We tell stories like this to remind people love can grow in the most unexpected places. The breeze picked up slightly. Caroline stood to cover the boys with a blanket. Jake helped her. As they bent down together, their hands touched again. They didn't move away. It started with a phone call. Jake was in his office, Caroline reading to the twins in the garden, when his assistant patched through a call from Lauren's parents. They were coming into town unexpectedly. They hadn't seen the boys in over a year and wanted to drop by the next day. Jake froze. He hadn't told them anything, not about the boys' progress or Caroline, and definitely not that they'd said they wished she were mommy. But he agreed, out of guilt, out of habit. The next afternoon, Mr. and Mrs. Wainwright arrived. Stiff, elegant, cold. Lauren's mother took one look at Caroline walking Aiden and Ethan across the lawn and arched an eyebrow. "She's the nanny?" she asked flatly. Jake hesitated. "Yes, that's Caroline. She's been helping." "She's black," Lauren's father said. Not malicious, just observational in that old money-cutting way. Jake didn't respond. In the living room, Caroline served tea with quiet grace, staying in the background as the grandparents interacted with the boys. But the twins didn't run to them, didn't laugh, didn't speak. They sat quietly by Caroline, eyes wide, unsure. Lauren's mother noticed. "They seem too attached," she said sharply. "To her." Jake tried to ease it. "She's been here every day. They trust her." Lauren's father added coldly, "Be careful. The last thing you need is them calling someone else mommy." Caroline's hands froze over the teacups. The words hit like a slap. Jake said nothing, and in that silence, everything cracked. That night, Caroline packed her things quietly. Jake found her by the staff hallway, suitcase by the door. "You're leaving?" he asked. She nodded. "It's clear I've overstepped." "You haven't." "They're your children, Mr. Anderson. I'm not their mother, and I never tried to be." Jake stepped forward. "Then why are you walking away?" Caroline's voice trembled. "Because it's not enough to love them. I have to be invisible to stay here, and I'm tired of being invisible." Jake didn't answer. He didn't defend her. He didn't stop her. He just watched her walk out the door. And something in him broke too. The next morning, the twins searched every room in the house. "Caro?" Ethan called softly. No reply. "Caro?" Aiden echoed, holding his bubble wand in a tiny fist. They checked the kitchen, the garden, the playroom. They waited at the door for her usual knock, but it never came. And by noon, both boys sat under the staircase, silent, curled up, and not speaking again. Upstairs, Jake stared at her empty room, unmade bed, missing shoes, the faint scent of lavender still in the air. And for the first time in years, Jake Anderson whispered something he hadn't said out loud since the day Lauren died. "I need you." The house was silent again, but it wasn't the old silence, the kind that lingered after the boys' tantrums or Jake's meetings. This one was different. It was lonely. The twins barely ate, barely moved. The laughter that had briefly lit up Sandcastle Estate had dimmed to a flicker. Jake noticed, but he didn't know how to fix it. He tried reading to them, tried the pancakes, even tried the bubble wand, but they just looked at him with hollow hope, as if asking, "Where is she? Why did you let her leave?" And Jake had no answer. Across town, Caroline stood in the cramped kitchen of her cousin's apartment, a modest place in East San Diego, far from the ocean, far from the estate, far from the boys. She stared at the job application on her phone, another housekeeping position. Good pay, no kids, no emotional attachment. She tapped on apply, but didn't hit send. Instead, she sat at the window, hands in her lap, and she whispered into the quiet, "Do they miss me?" Then, "Does he?" That night, Jake sat in the twins' playroom, flipping through one of their drawing pads. He found a crayon sketch he hadn't seen before. It was simple, 2 stick figures, one tall, one smaller, and beside them, a woman with long braids, blowing bubbles. 3 words scribbled underneath in shaky letters. "Caro is home." Jake's breath caught, and for the first time in his life, Jake Anderson didn't think, Didn't analyze, didn't wait. He just grabbed his keys. Caroline heard the knock just after 9 p.m. She hesitated. Her cousin peeked out the window and turned, wide-eyed. It's a man, a tall one, expensive car. Looks like a senator or something. Caroline opened the door slowly. Jake stood there, windblown, eyes tired, hands empty. For a long moment, they just looked at each other. Then he spoke. "I didn't defend you," he said softly. Caroline folded her arms, not from anger, but from protection. "No, you didn't." "I should have," he continued. "Not because of what they said, but because of what I didn't. I didn't say you mattered. I didn't say you changed my life. I didn't say, I need you." Caroline blinked hard. "I'm not trying to erase her," she whispered. "I never was." "I know," he said. "They're your boys. I was just—" He cut her off gently. "You're their home." At this moment, if it were you, would you take him back? Would you forgive the silence, the hesitation, the fear? Tell us in the comments. Jake stepped forward, eyes searching hers. "I'm not asking you to come back as a maid," he said. Caroline's voice caught. "Then what are you asking?" He exhaled. "Come back as you. As the woman who makes my sons feel safe. As the woman who made this house feel alive again. As the woman who taught me how to feel again." Tears slipped down her cheek. She didn't respond. Not yet. The next morning, the gates of Sandcastle Estate opened slowly. Just after sunrise, Jake stood beside the boys at the front door, their small hands gripping his. None of them had slept much, but the bags under Jake's eyes weren't just from exhaustion, they were from relief. Because Caroline said yes. Her car pulled into the long, winding drive, the ocean breeze rustling the bougainvillea. As she stepped out, Aidan and Ethan ran, not walked, not tiptoed, ran. "Caro." She bent to her knees just in time to catch them both in her arms. They didn't speak. They just held her, tightly. Jake walked slowly toward them, his hands in his pockets, uncertain. Caroline stood, one hand still resting protectively on Ethan's shoulder. Jake met her eyes. "Welcome home," he said. Caroline looked at him for a long moment, then smiled, just a little. "It's good to be home." Over the weeks that followed, the house changed, not in design or wealth, but in spirit. The laughter returned, fuller this time, more permanent. The kitchen wasn't just for staff. It became a place for pancakes, flower fights, and sticky syrup hands. The garden wasn't just scenery. It was a canvas for chalk, bubbles, and quiet breakthroughs. And Jake didn't just observe anymore. He joined. Awkwardly at first. But Caroline never laughed at him. She just said, "Try again." And he did. One afternoon, after a walk by the cliffs, the four of them sat on a picnic blanket, watching the tide roll in. Ethan rested his head in Caroline's lap. Aidan held Jake's hand. Jake turned to her and said quietly, "I don't know what this is yet, but I know it's real." Caroline smiled. "That's enough for now." Jake leaned back, letting the sea air carry away the last traces of his old grief. Not erase it, but make space beside it, for new things, hope, joy, love. Inside the house, above the playroom doorway, a new crayon drawing had been taped to the wall. 4 stick figures, holding hands, a bubble in the air, and beneath it, in messy blue letters, "This is family." Do you believe true love can grow from the most unexpected places? If this story touched you, even just once, hit that subscribe button. We tell stories that remind you, broken things can be beautiful again.